Okay, welcome to the Orchestra podcast, Dr. Tigran Arakelyan. He is here to talk to us today about who knows what. This is going to be a pretty open-ended discussion. Hi Tigran, how are you?
Hi, everyone. Nathan, thank you so much for having me. This is fantastic. I remember when you were on my podcast, we talked about you having a podcast, and I'm so excited that you have one because you're just so much knowledge about various things, and also you're just great at just having a conversation, which I think podcasts are all about. It should be a conversation, not planned out kind of a format, because I personally, I don't consider myself a journalist, so I do say that I just want to have a conversation, not actual questions or anything. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, you hit the nail right on the head there. This isn't like an interview that I have a laundry list of things that I need from you. This is really just a way for me to keep students involved with music without having classroom rehearsals, and for educators to maybe spend some of their time sitting at home learning something new, or and they learn more from us having a conversation that isn't going any particular direction than if I was asking. Because if I really had a question that I needed from you specifically, I could probably find it on Google from somebody else who's answered it before. But the things that we just happen upon having a conversation, I take more value in.
Yeah.
So I suppose we can start talking about what do you do? What's your passion?
Well, now as far as actual jobs that I have, I work with two youth orchestra programs in Bainbridge and Federal Way, and we've been fortunate enough to have you a couple of times in Bainbridge to work with my kids. And then I conduct a community orchestra in Port Townsend during the summers. I work with Northwest Mahler Festival and California Philharmonic, and do various guest conducting stuff. So staying busy. I'm passionate as a music educator. I consider myself a music educator working with the various youth orchestras. I'm passionate about music education, and also even with professional orchestras or community orchestras, implementing things that work with youth and support the youth, give them opportunities, because I think it's very important in today's world, especially in the classical music, to educate. In general, it's very important to educate. Education is very important, but with classical music specifically, it's very important to do that and keep financing and putting finances in education, because we need people in the concert halls. The job market, as you know, as many people who are classical musicians, you'll apply to a job for conductors or even for an oboist with a professional orchestra. You might get thousands of applications. Maybe 100 of them are very well qualified people for that particular job with this professional orchestra, but there aren't many opportunities. So there are lots of amazing musicians out there who want to pursue a career in music, but then for some reason I still feel like the concert halls are not as packed. Some are around the country, but I just wish it was a lot more than that. And sometimes I hear statistics. I read something a couple of months ago, I can't remember what publication it was, but said something like, oh, this, and I won't name the orchestra, but major orchestra, top 5, I would say, is selling out concerts. They've done better than ever. But then we forget the time period. That's compared to, 30, 40 years ago when the population was much less. Of course, they're doing better. But 50 years ago, we didn't have that many people in that city. So that city should have 2 professional orchestras now, considering the population growth, So concerts are selling for some orchestras, doing well, and I hope they continue to do well after this situation. But I just wish and I hope that we educate and get more people in the concert halls and excited about music education. And listening to music and being part of it and supporting it, not just playing it, So I care a lot about that, and I just hope to see classical music keep growing, and we have, every major city should have 2 professional orchestras.
Well, that's a lot to unpack that we just went through there. If we could even back up kind of to the beginning of what you were saying, something that I've noticed and something that I really appreciate that you bring to the podium every time is a conductor of any level with any ensemble. You can immediately spot whether or not they're thinking about conducting as an educator or as a professional. And when you get somebody on the podium who is thinking about it as an educator, maybe even somebody that has worked with youth, younger people, or currently does, especially somebody who currently does, I think you get just as much of the high level of, I wouldn't say perfection necessarily, but the kind of musicality that you can get out of a group at the same high technical level. But the group overall is much happier and much more willing to work for you. There's something about that egotistical maestro mentality. I mean, we've all tried it. I've been there too. That it just doesn't work for a group.
Yeah.
You know, they want to look at it like a team, and they want to feel respected. And when a horn player, you know, is chipping a note over and over and over again, they're not going to get it by you pointing out that they're chipping that note. Oh, they know they're doing it. But if you approach it like an educator, and maybe you yourself are a horn player in this situation, you might have something to offer. If you're not a horn player, I'm not. Maybe have a private conversation with that person later, but it's not going to help anybody in that room to point out the mistake that everybody can hear.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. And I've been in a youth orchestra where those things have happened. As a player, I've been in that in that room, in that space, when I've seen this happen. It's not good at all, and it's just made things for classical music worse and worse, because when you push people away, when you keep picking on people, they're not going to want to be there. Some people will, and this is something that we've briefly talked about before: Soviet music education, and you might excite some people for a bigger challenge, but that's a very small percentage. You might pick on people, you know, keep pushing them, keep just attacking them verbally and be abusive, and maybe they'll still be excited to play for you and to be there because they're just excited about that specific thing. But for the most part, you're not going to get people excited. You're going to push people away, and they're not going to want to continue music. You don't even want 90% of those kids to be musicians. I mean, you might want to, but 90% of them are not going to want to be musicians. But you want them to be respectful and caring about this art form. And when you keep doing that, they're going to walk out of there 10 years later. Even if they're part of your program for 10 years, they're going to leave, and they're not going to want to have anything to do with them, with music or arts.
When I think back on my youth orchestra experiences when I was in junior high and high school, I don't particularly remember how well we played. That's not what was important to me, or at least that's not what has lasted. The memories that lasted for me were the people that I played that music with, the repertoire that we played, and the way that the conductors interacted with us. I had some great youth orchestra conductors in the Tacoma Youth Symphony that I have stayed in touch with, and I really appreciate all that they did for me and that they keep doing for students. But they put on some great concerts, and they're making great music, but the best thing that they're doing is creating a space for kids to experience that music, not making the best performance ever, because the kids they're not going to remember that. That's not what it's about. It's about having these experiences, making music.
100% agree. 100% agree. That's what music should be all about, is those experiences. And you know, going back to something we talked about with El Sistema and the Soviet music education. And I know there's a lot of criticism about El Sistema. So I've been a little bit part of the post-Soviet music program, and I've never been part of an El Sistema program. I've seen people talk about it. I actually had someone who does the Play on Philly, which is the El Sistema program in Philadelphia.
Sam Thomas, is that his thing?
Stanford Thompson, yeah.
Stanford Thompson, sorry.
Yeah, Stanford Thompson, and he's been on my podcast and he's talked about this. So I know there's a lot of passionate people about that program. I don't want to promote both of those programs, but one thing that from my observations, I've noticed about El Sistema that's different, and some people might argue that it's not, but from the Soviet program, is that it's a lot more inclusive, at least from what I've seen, from my experiences of observing people and seeing what they do, because at least in the Soviet time, it was just it was very rigorous, and with both the athletes and the musicians and the artists, it was about this winning mentality that was applied to the arts that just doesn't work. I don't think it works. Of just you have to be the greatest. So when we send you out to the greatest competitions in the world, competing against the American, you could be the winner. That and that was very much pushed in a very aggressive way. And also the Tchaikovsky competition, the first Tchaikovsky competition, when Van Cliburn went in as an American and won the first competition. But that also actually, that incident, and I know I'm jumping to different topics, but that instance, that competition made me realize that, even though they were really probably trying to push a Russian to win or a Soviet musician to win the competition, they were still sort of open to the idea of having someone else, win the competition. And I remember when, my grandma was here a couple of months ago, and I had a Van Cliburn record I put, and she was like, "Oh, you're playing Van Cliburn." When he did a Soviet tour, apparently, I think either he passed somewhere, either Sochi area or somewhere in Armenia, and my grandmother was able to attend the concert.
Wow.
She was like, "Oh, he was great," and everyone was so happy. Even people who maybe didn't like the Americans at the time during this whole Soviet America thing, were still in love with Van Cliburn and what he did and winning that competition. So. Going back to El Sistema and Soviet program, me as a young musician in 95, 96, I went to this post-Soviet at the time because Armenia got out in 91. I went to this music institution. It's not private lessons. They had these free public music schools, basically, prep programs, and I went, and you have to do a test, and you have to do some rhythmic tests. They tap, and you have to do the same, or try to do, whether you're 5 or 9, doesn't matter, or 12 or whatever. You do these various tests, and then they play something on the piano. They'll say, is that higher or lower than this note? They'll test you. They'll do various tests that they do, and then they'll say, okay, well, if you have great ears, they'll put you on a violin, cello, or something, or string instrument, and if you didn't, then you could pick any other instrument. And as you know, during the Soviet time, as you might know, violin, cello, and piano were the top instruments. That's what they really wanted people to train and do. So my parents, going into that music program, I had a lot of breathing problems. I had a chronic condition. I spent months and months in children's hospitals, and my parents wanted me to play a wind instrument. And so going in, they already knew they wanted me to play a wind instrument, and then they picked the flute for me. So that's how my journey started. But
I think we had talked at some point, if you want to be a string player, it's even more difficult. Is there something along those lines?
Yeah, well, the string players, historically, even not Soviet, as you know, a lot of repertoire was composed for violin, for piano, for cello, concertos, and those were the soloists that went around the world performing their concertos or having solo recitals. I mean, who goes around the world performing bassoon concertos? Not too many of those. Or who goes and listens to bassoon recitals other than, I mean, if we're being honest, other than those people who are really into bassoon playing, you're not going to get 1,000 people into a concert hall listening to a bassoon recital, but you will get 1,000 people back then, maybe hundreds back then, 1,000, maybe 1,000 now, to go and listen to Itzhak Perlman or any other famous violinist or cellist or pianist. So those were the instruments that were pushed very aggressively in the Soviet Union and around the world, really.
Well, so as we think about these, I don't even know what we call them, the government instructed public music youth programs. How could those work? Because when you look at El Sistema or you look at the Soviet programs, those are operating under really specific conditions. In Venezuela, it's a much smaller country, at least in the recent history, but not currently. They had a lot of excess government funds to throw around at things, and they could make these kinds of programs available to lift people out of poverty, give somebody a chance to not just stay in their small village and never leave, a chance to get out. But here in America, that's we've got a completely different deck of cards that we're dealing with. People already have access to, public schools that are more or less operating under acceptable conditions. I mean, you wake up in your small village and walk down to like a, poorly constructed shanty where maybe there's a Catholic nun who's going to administer some, flavor of education to you. I mean, we've got a pretty established infrastructure, and even the poorest in our country still have enough ability to get around and travel to some degree. So how do we, with all of the distractions that we have, those of us that have the means to, like kids that are in soccer clubs, or maybe they do theater, they do choir, and they do orchestra, how do we create the space to have anything that resembles this kind of El Sistema or Soviet program, which is basically a full-time pullout? There's no way we could do anything like that.
Yeah, but as you know, there's El Sistema programs around this country as well, and some of them are doing really well. As I mentioned, Play on Philly, they're doing really well. And in Venezuela, apparently they have close to 700 or 800,000 kids in the El Sistema program with over 400, 500, 600 locations. So I think something has to give. Mm-hmm. If you want to have that kind of a rigorous program where kids have to be part of that program for certain hours each week, for certain hours each day, mm-hmm. then the soccer has to, you can't do soccer. I mean, something has to give. You can't just torture the kids, have them in classrooms all day, and then take them to these after-school programs, and it just can't happen. But I do see that even in the U.S. now, even with some of my youth orchestra kids, even though it's a once-a-week thing, I see them coming out of a soccer practice, a baseball thing, this art club that they're part of, this other club that they're part of. It's a lot of work. And if you want a someone well-rounded, maybe you could have those things. But if you want someone to be a little bit more focused and much better at that particular thing, then maybe something has to give, so you only do two things instead of and I love sports, but I just having 4 or 5 different things that they're part of, I don't know if they could be very focused and get at that one thing or those two things that they do. But I do believe that just doing music, it's probably, I wouldn't want to do it that way. I've done a lot of music in my youth, but I wouldn't want to do it that way. I wish in some ways I did more sports, for example, because that's also important. Physical activity is also important. So I don't know what we could do in this country, and as you mentioned, actually, music programs, the one that you have and others around the country are very well put together. Of course, there are places. For example, I'll talk about my experience with Bainbridge Island. They don't have a string program, so parents got together and made a youth orchestra, so the kids who play string instruments have this opportunity to also play in an ensemble. So there are places that lack certain things, but then there are many, many places around the country that have amazing programs like yours and others around the country. So I don't know what you could do or if you want to do it that way, but there are many problems with government-funded music education. A government-funded music education might be good for the first 5 years of a child's life. And I don't even know if that could be good depending on how it's done, if it's like very strict and physical and mental abuse, abusive teachers, like I'm talking about some in the Soviet era, it's probably not a good idea even for the 7-year-old that's learning piano. But if it's a positive place and it's government funded, then maybe early music education is good, but you have to keep in mind that if it's government funded, if someone is telling you how to do things and when to do things and what to do, you could think of all these great composers from Dmitri Shostakovich to Khachaturian to all these other composers that got to that professional level, and now they have these restrictions. You could compose this, but you can't compose this. And so I think music education, early level, early time, government funded is good, but as it gets to the conservatory level where you have to think about all these giants, composers, and other people and other musical ideas, it might not be a good thing, because you get to the conservatory level. And I was talking to my grandma, again, another example, someone who's been part of that program since she in her youth. Then she was a teacher in that same system.
Okay.
She didn't know many American composers who were sort of big revolutionary composers in America who were doing amazing things, but they didn't know about those, and they weren't taught those in the Soviet program, because they wanted to push their own musicians, and also the composers from the West that fit the idea of a composer that they wanted to be promoted in the Soviet Union. So in the conservatory level, in the high professional level, I don't think it's a good idea to have government funded, unless you have such an ideal government that's so accepting and so welcoming that you could do that. And I don't know, at some point you get to places where you have a Ministry of Culture or Ministry, I don't even know if there's a Ministry of of Music, but Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Education in these various countries that are going to push their agenda. They're going to bring someone in who's going to say, well, that guy I went to the conservatory with, or I went to this art school, I'm going to push their stuff, I like their ideas. So I don't know how good it is, and this is a big topic. This could be argued about, and I don't even know.
We can answer some questions, maybe. So I'm in charge of a youth orchestra, hypothetical here.
Yeah.
And I have an opportunity to start some kind of program that's free to kids. How do I balance the rigor of hours put in with making it fun for the kids to participate? And where do I draw the line where somebody isn't trying hard enough? Because one of the things that we were just talking about was the kids doing so many different things. If you're doing soccer and baseball and tennis and drama, and you're in 3 AP classes and you want to do the youth orchestra, at what point does one of those groups need to say something's got to give, or do we just continue to be accommodating because the point is to provide experiences, not necessarily to produce the top quality? Because I feel like these programs could work and work really well if the goal was just to create a space for experiences in music, not necessarily to have the best orchestra in the universe.
Yeah.
If you cut that part out, it's a different organism altogether.
Yeah. In my opinion, challenge is part of the growth. So you have to be able to, and it's tough. You don't have an easy situation. And I always say public school teachers are absolutely fantastic, but you sort of, for the most part, have about 3 to 5 days with those kids a week, right? So you see them much more often. And so, but you have to be able to challenge them. I mean, you can't just have an environment where they just come in and we play some easy stuff. They're just fill that hour and then leave, not having any sort of a challenge and experience. Challenge is part of the growth, and you have to be able to push them to a certain extent to give them a challenge. And a few people are not gonna want to get up to that, take your challenge. There are going to be some kids who are not going to want to do that, and that's okay. And of course, we should be trying to our best to be accommodating. And if I see the kids that are not up for the challenge, how far I've pushed them, I talk to them privately and I ask them what I could do for them and how we could make it a more enjoyable experience for them. But I want to do it for most of the kids and get them to that place where they can be challenged. And of course, as I said, there are exceptions, but those exceptions you have to talk on an individual basis and figure that out with them. But to just make an environment, which I've also seen with some teachers, to make an environment where they just come in and they just play a little bit and they play easy repertoire for that age group, it's just not a positive thing. You're not doing good service. As a parent, I would be upset if I saw that. I'd rather see them a little bit more challenged, a little bit on the edge, never too much where you're pushing them out. And I don't think you or many of the teachers I've met are that type of people where they will just push them so hard that they'll break. No, you push them to a certain extent where they're like, okay, you know what? I do need to put in those 15 extra minutes at home to practice, even take out my violin and play a scale on it or something. You have to give them that little edge. I don't know how else to answer it other than you don't be afraid to push them a little bit more than you feel that you can. I think many kids, especially at that age, it's such a great age group to be pushed and to grow and to get better. That's why they say, scientists and people who are much smarter than I am, they say, teach your kids multiple languages when they're younger, because they're able to accept that challenge. Mm-hmm. and grow and learn those different languages. So I'll give you an example, and I think you were part of this. I don't remember if you were in the room at the time, but Bainbridge Youth Orchestra, I organized a festival. We invited this famous violinist, Andrew Jocelyn, who plays with a lot.
Yeah, I was at that one.
Yeah, a lot of pop and rock acts, and Macklemore and all these other famous artists. Well, I don't remember if you were in the room at that moment, but we had some kids improvise, and we had high school kids, juniors and seniors. He was like, "Oh, improvise in C major or something basic," and these kids were terrified. They didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And we got like this 10-year-old, a couple of 10-year-olds, younger kids, way younger, and he was like, "Oh, play whatever you want." And some of these kids were like, "Whatever, I'll play." They played all kinds of different. I was impressed, and that was such an amazing moment for me to realize that when they're the younger they are, they're just more excited and they just go for it. They're not afraid to make a few mistakes. Okay, they asked me to play C major, I'll play an F major, or I'll play in something else. I don't care, whatever, I'll do it. They're up for the challenge, and that was such a great thing to see. So we can challenge them. Don't be afraid to challenge the kids.
Well, it's at some point, especially as a teenager, mm-hmm. everything becomes uncomfortable. Uh-huh. And as outside of music, whatever it is, everything starts to put you in this place of discomfort. And as we get older and older, that discomfort crusts over to the point where if you try and pull it back, everything sort of starts, bleeding internally. Mm-hmm. But when you're younger and you haven't, realized what, playing a wrong note on stage is embarrassing. If you don't know that that's something that you need to be embarrassed by, there's mm-hmm. nothing stopping you from, trying something like improvising, mm-hmm. because there's no fear associated with failure at that point.
Yeah. And something I tell my youth orchestra kids, or even, you've played in an orchestra with me. I might have even said that to an adult orchestra, but in the performance time, when you get into that performance time, in rehearsal, yeah, we try to fix it. You're in the performance, it's about the passionate performance. It's mm-hmm. about an exciting performance. Play a few wrong notes, but just it has to have that, just amazing feeling, especially in those big epic moments. You have those in Mahler and Shostakovich, just big, enormous. You play the right note with the wrong intensity, with the wrong passion, it's just nothing. Might as well.
It's one of those famous quotes from Beethoven. I think it was a letter to who, I forget, but it's to play a wrong note is excusable. To play a note without passion is unforgivable. Something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think about that all the time. And I love that quote. That's great. Yeah.
So as we're thinking about the challenging students to do better, so we're kind of riding the rail of trying to produce the best technical product that we can, but not pushing too hard. Yeah. How do we create a space where they're still having fun? So it's still rigorous, they're still being challenged, but how do we create this environment where everybody still wants to come out every Saturday or whatever day of the week the youth orchestra meeting?
That's a tough question. But I think one way, and I'm not saying any of what I said, challenging and pushing them a little bit is finding that balance is not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. It's a really tough thing to do. But repertoire is one thing. Then having stuff where you could really push them, but also bringing repertoire that they might enjoy, or that might be a little bit easier, so they're really having fun and enjoying that experience. So repertoire is one thing. The other thing is, which is something I've done before, is challenging some kids. Not all of them want to do this, but having them come up and conduct. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've tried that, but one thing I've seen you try as well with your orchestras is having the orchestra, maybe not a very hard piece that needs a conductor, but a piece that's okay and challenging, whatever, but having them do it as a group, and telling them that they could do it together as a group, and they could come together and perform that piece and be together, and challenging them to do that, because that's a different challenge, watching and playing together and listening to each other, and always telling them the things to, it's orchestra is not just a time where you come together and you watch the conductor. You do that, of course, but it's also a time where you learn how to listen. And as I always say with my youth orchestras, all of these skills are such great skills that you can apply to your daily life, to your relationships, listening to others, playing with others, respecting others, being on time. You're not. I had an incident with one of my youth orchestra kids, and that person didn't get the concertmaster position.
Oh,
very upset. Senior in orchestra. Comes to me, says, "Hey, so I'm quitting youth orchestra. I beat the person who got concertmaster in our high school orchestra, and I can't believe I didn't beat him. So I'm not gonna do youth orchestra. I really thought I'm gonna be concertmaster."
What a waste.
So I asked her. I said, "Hey, what do you want to do with your life?" She's like, "Well, it's something in the medical field." I was like, imagine you get into a situation where you're struggling with something, you don't do it. Are you just going to quit? This is the time to learn. This is the time that you have to learn these things in youth orchestra, where you're given a bad situation, you don't agree with that situation, but you still have to do your best. And her parents were in the room when I said this, and her mom came to me crying. She hugged me after she left the room. She's like, "Thank you so much for having that talk with her." You have to learn these skills in public school, in private school, in your orchestra. You have to learn how to deal with rejection. You have to learn how to deal with some bad situations that you might not agree with.
Yep. And these kinds of choices that kids and families are making in high school years and maybe early college, it locks it down and it sets a pattern for you. When I think about the choices that I made in high school or my first couple years in college, I mean, that's the way that every situation in my life continues to work out, because of the way that I learned to deal with those situations. And the unfortunate choices that we all make, it's really hard to unlearn those. So if you make that choice to just quit, that's going to be a pattern that plagues you the rest of your life.
Exactly.
And if you don't recognize that it was that choice you made back in high school, you're going to be stuck with that, and you won't be able to undo it unless you really unpack what happened and why you continue to make those choices.
Exactly. It's youth orchestra. Any of these organized activities are the best place to learn how you're just going to be an adult, how you're going to deal with life situations and get better. And one thing I want to add is that as educators, as conductors, we make mistakes too. It's not just about the students. So maybe me or some other conductors made the mistake. They didn't pick the right person for that position. It's okay, because that's going to happen in life. Guess what? You're going to apply to a job. You might not get it. You might be way better than the other person, but you didn't get it. So what? Move on, get better, learn, and learn from that experience. It's okay. It's not just your fault. And this is to the students. It's not just your fault. It's other people's fault too, but you have to learn how to deal with it.
The piece you were talking about earlier that I did with my freshman orchestra, where they played without conductor, absolutely, that performance would have been more secure and maybe have sounded better if I had been up there, waving the baton. But the choice we were making in that situation, as you pointed out, was that what they were accomplishing wasn't playing that piece as best as they possibly could. And if that was our goal, then I absolutely made a mistake. But if the goal was to put them in that uncomfortable space where they're forced to rely on each other, and their success or failure is 100% dependent on their ability to trust each other, that was more valuable to me. And as we look back on these situations where we thought that we made the mistake, not that, where you were the result of a mistake, like, applying for a job and you didn't get it, you don't know why. But if you're the person, doling out these choices, if you look at it from a certain perspective, maybe it's not a mistake. Like this student that maybe should have been concertmaster, or if that really is the situation, well, clearly this is somebody that needs to learn how to follow. If they're being so averse to not getting the leadership role, that's somebody who absolutely has to learn to follow now. And they're getting that opportunity. So even this mistake has exactly the benefit that they needed.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. And it's um, it's a tough situation, and you understand kids because you've been there and you know how the dynamics are. um, I didn't get it and this other person got it, but I'm way better. I won the state competition in this and I won that, but I didn't get it. And another thing to keep in mind, it's
Mhm.
the day. You might wake up one day and you're just not having a good day. You're not ready to play. Maybe it's a time during the day that you're just not ready. Maybe the other person had just such a fantastic day and they were just ready for that particular moment. You just never know. These things happen. And sometimes you hear from famous artists and the famous athletes, oh, I was rejected this many times. Michael Jordan was rejected this many times, but they were great. All these people didn't understand how great it was. But it's not just about that. Maybe he wasn't ready for that particular day. Maybe
Mm.
at that time in his life he was just not ready. And then what's great about some of these artists is not that they were wrongly rejected, but what's great about them is that they were rejected, they weren't accepted, but they still worked hard. They said, you know what, I'm gonna work harder and do it again, work harder and do it again,
Well,
and do the best that I can. That's all
that
you
gets back to the maestro mentality we were talking about earlier, where it's that I should have been the one to get it is this a very narcissistic
yeah.
position to be taking. And really we need to have this growth mindset of what could I have done better? Not
Mhm.
that I did deserve it or I don't deserve it or I'm better or I'll never be good enough, but just that I can be better.
Mhm.
And you can have a healthy amount of reflection of looking back on what could I do next time, but not what could I do differently,
Yeah.
but just what can I do next time?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
whatever event or competition or interview, it's already happened. You can't change it. But what are you going to do now? Are
Yeah.
you going to cry forever that you didn't get the thing that you wanted? Or are you going to put some work in and try and get something else?
Yeah. No, that's great, Nathan. You said it. I don't know what else to add to that.
As we continue this conversation, I think we've pretty much eaten up the youth orchestra topic.
Yeah.
Um, what's new in the orchestra world? What's going on with conductors? When I was on your podcast, we talked about allegations of misconduct going on in the conducting world, which is it's still kind of going on, but we've pretty much eaten up through most people. But what's the hot news now?
Well, I don't know if there's any hot news. The hot news now is how orchestras are dealing with the current situation, COVID-19, and how people are dealing with the situation in general. So it's a tough situation. I don't know about any recent allegations, but that's really the main thing, COVID-19 and how
Mm.
orchestras will come out of this. And I do hope, I've been talking to a lot of colleagues, and I do hope that since people didn't have the experience of going to live events, going to museums, going to theaters, going to music venues to listen to orchestral or chamber music,
Mm.
hopefully coming out of this, they'll be so excited that they'll go back and do it. But I hope, but one thing I fear is that um, when people don't have jobs and when people are not doing
Uh,
well financially, arts might be the first thing that goes. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, at least in Armenia, in my opinion,
mm.
looking at a post-Soviet small country, which is different than the U.S., for example, with a huge country, but looking at Armenia, had a very thriving and just amazing art scene, poets, authors, for a
Mm.
small country that had so many different things going for them. And then the Soviet Union broke off, all these things happening in a small country, no electricity, no water, no lots of things that people were just stressing out. My parents, stressing out about how to even buy a piece of bread. All of these things that were so stressful for people, took away from most people. Didn't have the opportunities for arts. They weren't even thinking about the arts. The government wasn't able to support the arts, so it kind of fell,
Mm.
didn't work. And so a lot was lost in that time period, 91 to like 2001 in Armenia, or even 2011, I should say. A lot was lost, and just appreciation and respect for arts was lost because, or maybe even if it wasn't lost, it was just kind of, put on a, back seat or whatever, however you say that. So I just hope that doesn't happen. I hope that when we come out of this, will still have strong enough economy, strong enough people working and happy to be able to go and enjoy those things in their life, which is the arts. And hopefully we don't take away from those organizations. I'm a little bit afraid. I'm hoping that this has a positive impact later, and not a negative impact.
Well, to reference the now cliched TED Talk with Benjamin Zander, he's talking about all of these people who are on boards of symphonies and other arts organizations. They're thinking about how can we get the number of people in the whole world that love classical music from 3% to 4%. Wouldn't that be great if we just get it from 3 to 4?
Yeah.
And he says, why not 100?
Yeah.
So, but the issue there is that if you want to do the powdered wigs and the tuxedos and make people, pay $50, $80, $100, $200 to see a concert in a concert hall in a large city where they have to pay for parking and they got to pay for the ticket ahead of time and spend all of this time getting wherever to the venue itself, that's creating a lot of barriers. And if you want to get past 3% of people that love going to live classical music performances, we need to change the paradigm of how classical music operates.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, how can we reach more people and continue to provide a space for professional musicians to be employed making music and reach an audience that wants to hear this music?
First, I'll say that Benjamin Zander is fantastic. He's a big advocate for classical music and is the conductor and founder, I think, hopefully I'm not mistaken, of Boston Philharmonic. And he's works with a lot of youth orchestras, including the Boston Philharmonic Youth Orchestra. Fantastic individual. What we could do is, or something that some orchestras already do, is go out and be in those communities and be in those spaces. Because as you said, one of the reasons why it's tougher for some people to come out to the concert hall, because they have to pay for all those things and then pay for a ticket and have, just go out of their way to get somewhere. And getting to downtown in any city is not an easy thing to do. So we have to go to them. And by going to them, it's not just, sending 10 musicians to go to them. We have to go to them. If you're the big orchestra in that city, you're going to that other town next to your city with your full force. You're going there with your orchestra, and hopefully there's a venue to support that. If there isn't, you still have to max it out and go with your full, as big of an orchestra as you can, to show that you're not just sending 5 people to say, hey, we sent a few people to play for you poor people. No, we're coming in, big organization, we're coming in and putting on a show for you like we would if you were to come to our own concert hall, and with our music director.
Yes.
Because one thing, some of the greatest conductors, Leonard Bernstein and all these other conductors that were such big advocates for arts, they didn't call these children's concerts. They didn't call these outreach concerts. Let's give it to the assistant conductor. Let's bring some random cover conductor to do this. No, you're the face of the orchestra, and you're going to go with that orchestra to that smaller hall, to that not very acoustically nice hall, 30 miles out or 20 miles outside of your own concert hall, and play and conduct and excite the audience the way you would in your big fancy concert hall. But with your music director, with most of your musicians, and be there in that city saying, we care about you and we're here to play for you as well. And even though our main hall is there, but we're coming in to your town to play for you. So going out of your way. I know some orchestras are doing it, but I wish the major orchestras did that, because I do see some small things happening, as I mentioned, sending some players, sending 20 players, sending 5 players. I don't like that. You have to go full force. You have to go with your orchestra and with your music director. And I think music directors now should be given a bit more responsibilities. And I know they're getting a lot of responsibilities, but with all these big management companies controlling how things are run, I think music directors should have more responsibilities of not just the Masterworks concerts where they conduct the fancy big masterpieces that they've always dreamed about conducting, but also conducting children's concerts, also conducting outreach concerts, pops concerts. They should be given a bit more responsibility in that sense.
And as an educator, I think these orchestras need to bring somebody in that has not just an opinion, but an informed perspective about how to put on these children's concerts.
Yeah.
Because kids have heard Peter and the Wolf before. They know what it is. There's so many, there's a great claymation video out there that I think every 4th grader in the United States has seen. it's good. It's a good piece of music. Prokofiev did a great job. It introduces the instruments in a beautiful way. Benjamin Britten's Young Person's Guide, another great piece. But you can't just do those two pieces and get kids to love music forever.
Yeah.
If we were talking to Benjamin Zander right now, he would be saying, why can't an 8-year-old love Mozart? Maybe they don't hear the whole Mozart symphony, but the last movement of the Hofner Symphony by Mozart.
Yeah.
You play that for anybody, they know who Mozart is or not, they're going to think that that is a rip-roaring piece of music, and they're going to look at the bass section playing those 16th notes so fast and think that they've seen something really stupendous.
Yeah.
So Peter and the Wolf is great, but let's put on some concerts for children that helps them to understand the full repertoire of classical music, not just things written for children.
Yeah, and they're capable of it. That's another thing. They're capable of it.
Once you put the kids label on something, it's less.
Yeah.
It's not as much. Like if you think a kid's meal, well, it's not quite as nice food. It's probably processed chicken nuggets. Yeah, you get a toy, but it's less food. It's less quality.
Yeah.
Can I just have a real burger and fries? Let's give the kids the burger and fries. Don't dumb it down for them. Maybe it's a shorter concert. Maybe you have someone who comes out and explains. When I was in grade school, Christophe Charniard would come around with the Pacific Northwest. What was the Sinfonietta? Sorry, the Northwest Sinfonietta.
Yeah.
And it was just a quartet. It wasn't the full group. And I think every time I heard them, they just did the Bartok Romanian dances.
I like that piece.
Yes. It is a little more palatable for kids, but it's a real piece of the classical repertoire. And before each movement, he would explain what the dance was and why it's quick or why it's slow. And he'd talk about who Bartok was. But we would hear the whole piece of music performed by professionals and with the conductor of that ensemble there promoting it. Yeah. And that worked for me.
Yeah. And people now call it marketing, the ways you market classical music, but I call I want to say presentation, because it's about the way you get the audience and the kids excited about presenting what you're about to show them. Not saying, oh, this is, as you mentioned, kids meal or a kids version of things, but being excited about it, presenting the masterpiece and telling them how much you love it. Because as I remember I've programmed pieces where I know that some of the youth orchestras might not enjoy as much, but when I get excited about it, they get excited about it too. They're like, oh, okay, well, it sounds kind of weird. Maybe it's not something I enjoy, but he seems to be excited about it. He loves the piece. So let's just get it going and play the best that we can. So you have to get excited about it. And I know it's not an easy thing to do as a public school teacher. And I know it's probably much easier from my perspective as a youth orchestra conductor, where kids are, it's once a week, 90% of them, 99% of them take private lessons. So they're there to just do the youth orchestra thing. It's tougher to do, but every time I'm in that rehearsal, I'm excited. It's like, I do get excited, and I tell them I'm so excited to be there. I'm not joking. I look forward to that rehearsal every time. So, and they get excited too. So, it's a fun thing, and it's tough. It's not an easy thing. All of this said, public school teachers, Nathan, you, others are just doing a fantastic job. Something I would not be able to do, honestly.
Well, before we give up on the kids meal trope, it's if we want people to love classical music. We want to bring them into the house of classical music. We're not going to give them like a tiny dollhouse to play with and pretend like they're in the house. Let's show them the doormat. Yeah. And then they can come in to the house. So you give them a small taste, but it's the entry to the full house. You don't just give them their consolation prize and then you see them again next year when you have your children's concert. Yeah. You have to come in with this mindset that when they leave, they're going to go home and they're going to talk to their parents about, hey, in 3 weeks, they're doing the whole concert, where it's the whole symphony, not just the movement we heard today. And I want to hear the whole thing. Yeah. That's the mindset we have to have. Not just here's the piece that we made for you and that's what you get and we'll see you again next year. Yeah.
I love it. You said it. I don't know what else to add to that.
Well, there's still a lot more discussion here, but I think we've been on the horn about 50 minutes now.
Yeah.
longest one yet. I think we should maybe wrap this up. But first, I've been asking a number of my guests if there was something that you could go back and tell yourself when you were just starting out in music that would change your trajectory or have helped you to commit to music sooner, or to get past a hurdle that you had. What could you go back and tell a younger version of yourself?
Is it just one thing?
It can be several.
Okay, so a couple of things actually, and this is something I've thought about, and I wish I could go back. Wish there was a way. Learn more instruments, I think, and just practice the different instruments. Not be afraid to just, and I've said a lot about focus on one thing, but as a musician, I just wish I focused and was better at multiple instruments.
Music is the one thing. Anything you do inside of music is still the one thing.
Yeah. So that might be the biggest one. And another thing, I just had a podcast with another artist. Another thing, I've asked similar questions before to some of my guests in over 80 episodes now. Many of them have said practice. Just practice and do your best. Just work on it. I mean, and one thing that we're afraid of, and I was afraid of, and I wish I did better, is practice the details and take that time in your practice room to not be afraid to really take a small section and really break it down and think about things, not just oh, that's a D to an F. What kind of, how does that fit into the chord if I'm playing with a pianist or if I'm playing in an orchestra? Just be a little bit more curious about some of those details. Maybe that's something that comes as you grow and you're an adult and you know more about music. But I just wish I did some of those things a bit more when I was younger. So that's what it is.
All right. Well, I got some more questions for you off camera, but before we leave, how can people find out more about you?
My website. I'll share my website. Maybe you could put it in the description. My website also includes my podcast, so you could access my podcast through my website. So it's tigran.arakelyan.com. I'll give you the link.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having this conversation. I'm sure it's keeping my students engaged during this time, and I hope this podcast continues after we get to go outside again, because this has been really fun for me, connecting with the musicians that I love to make music with.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan. You're doing a fantastic job. I'm happy you have a podcast, and I encourage people to whatever job they have. If you're excited about what you're doing and you're able to share it, it's great to share it, because then other people learn from those experiences, and you get something out of it too. So, thank you so much for having me.
All right, thanks, Tigran.